It wasn't just soup. It was the base of 1,000 recipes. It was on every shelf, in every home. Think about where it lived in your kitchen. Not tucked away in some forgotten corner. Not behind the cereal boxes or beneath the dried pasta, but right there, front and center, in a row, sometimes two deep. The red and white labels facing out like a small, reliable army standing at attention. Campbell's soup, that red so particular, so specific, that you would have recognized it at the end of a very long hallway in a very dim light. That white so clean, so honest, and that gold medallion at the center of every can, the seal of something that had earned its place on that shelf and kept it, year after year, decade after decade, without fail. Close your eyes for just a moment if you like, and try to hear it. The sound of the can opener, not the smooth, silent electric ones that came later. The old handheld one. The one with the lever you press down into the lid. The pointed tooth that punctured the tin with that small, bright, satisfying clank, and then the slow, methodical crank of the handle going around the rim. One full revolution. The lid lifting at the edge, slightly curled, slightly sharp. And then, that smell, that first, concentrated breath of what was inside. Metallic and rich and specific to whatever soup it was. Tomato, warm and slightly acidic. Chicken noodle, savory and golden. Cream of mushroom, dense and earthy, almost mysterious in its depth. The can hadn't been fully opened yet, not entirely, but already the kitchen was beginning to change. Now, here is something that might have you looking at that red and white label in an entirely new way. There was a reason that can looked exactly the way it did, and it had nothing to do with soup, nothing to do with the kitchen, nothing to do with the color of tomatoes or the richness of cream. The label design that became one of the most recognized images in American history was inspired by something on a football field on an autumn afternoon at a university in upstate New York. And once you know the full story behind those colors, you will never reach for that can again without a small, quiet smile at the strangeness and the beauty of how things come to be. But let's not hurry. Good soup never hurries, and neither does a proper memory. The Campbell Soup Company had been in American kitchens long before the 1960s, long before most of the people watching this were born. It began in Campbell, New Jersey, in 1869, a small canning and preserving operation that eventually found its identity with condensed soup, a concentrated, shelf-stable product that changed the way American households thought about feeding a family. Condensed soup meant you could keep it for weeks, keep it for months, keep it on that pantry shelf as a quiet standing promise that no matter what happened, no matter how busy the week became, no matter how the grocery budget tightened, no matter how tired the cook was by Wednesday evening, there was always dinner. Open a can, add liquid, stir, and feed the people you love. By the time the 1960s arrived, Campbell's had been in American kitchens for over 60 years. It wasn't new. It wasn't fashionable. It was simply there, as permanently as the kitchen itself, and just as necessary. And there was something else hiding inside that familiar red and white label. Something that appeared in nearly every casserole of the decade. Something that showed up in more recipes than any other soup in the entire Campbell's lineup. And it wasn't tomato. It wasn't chicken noodle. It was earthier than both of them, quieter, less showy. The one that home cooks reached for, not when they were making a bowl of soup, but when they were making something more. Something that would come out of the oven, golden and bubbling, and fragrant enough to stop a family in their tracks from 2 rooms away. And the full story of how that one soup quietly became the most important can in the mid-century American pantry is something worth settling in for. In the 1960s, that shelf full of red and white cans meant everything, even if no one was stopping to say so. The decade was not always an easy one. There were headlines that worried people, changes arriving faster than anyone had quite expected, mornings when the newspaper on the kitchen table carried news that made the coffee taste different. But the pantry was steady. The pantry was a kind of anchor. And there, on that shelf, lined up in their quiet red and white certainty, were the cans. Tomato, ... chicken noodle, cream of mushroom, bean with bacon, do, vegetable beef, split pea with hamburger, minestrone, tea, cream of celery, French onion, dart, niserd, dattle bearnaise, acroy, cream of chicken, cheddar cheese, beef broth. Names so familiar, they were almost like family. Varieties so trusted that a mother, planning a week of meals on a Sunday evening with a notepad and a pencil and a particular quiet competence, could close her eyes and reach for the right can and know, absolutely know, that it would work, that it would feed her family, that it would be good. Do you remember which one ran out first? Which variety was always missing from the row before the week was half over? Always the first name on the grocery list. There was a particular satisfaction to the canned goods aisle in the 1960s. The soups were stacked high, 4 cans across, 3 rows deep, and you reached for them with the easy confidence of someone who had done it 100 times. The weight of a Campbell's can in a hand was a specific, familiar weight. Not too heavy, not too light. Balanced. The label cool and slightly waxy under your thumb. The gold medallion catching the fluorescent light of the grocery store. You put the cans in the cart and moved on because there was nothing to deliberate about. You knew what you needed. You trusted what you were getting. And that trust, that particular, hard-earned, absolutely reliable trust, was worth more than any amount of sophistication. What was the Campbell soup that meant comfort to you? And was it tomato, chicken noodle, or something else entirely? Picture a Tuesday afternoon in October. Not a special day, not a holiday, just an ordinary Tuesday, with the light going golden early, and the chill in the air that announced summer was genuinely finished now, not just resting. A child comes home from school. The back door opens and closes with that particular bang that every back door in America seemed to make in 1965, a sound that parents recognized from 3 rooms away without looking up. The child drops a school bag somewhere it doesn't belong, and from the kitchen, already, comes the sound of the can opener. That sound, that specific, unmistakable, deeply reassuring sound. The small metal clank of the tooth biting into the tin, the slow revolution of the crank, going around and around the rim with a steady patience that could not be hurried and didn't need to be. The lid lifting at the edge, slightly curled, a little sharp. If you were that child standing in the doorway with your jacket still on and one strap of your backpack still digging into your shoulder, you knew soup was happening. And everything, immediately, was better. The condensed soup came out of the can the way it always did, as a thick, smooth glop that held the shape of the container, a perfect cylinder of concentrated richness that slid from the tin with a soft ease, deliberate sound, and landed in the pot. It was almost startling. The first time you really noticed it as a child, how dense it was before it became something else. How much was compressed into that small, cool space? One can of soup, sitting in the bottom of a pot, waiting. Then came the liquid, 1 can of water, or 1 can of milk for the tomato, which was the right way to do it. The way that turned the soup from an ordinary orange red into that particular warm rose pink that meant snow days and sick days and every kind of afternoon that needed fixing. And then the stirring began. Do you remember the rhythm of your mother's stirring? The way she moved the spoon, the wooden one with the darkened bowl from years of use, or sometimes a long metal one, in slow, patient circles, working the dense concentrate into the liquid, watching it thin and smooth and transform, gradually, unmistakably, into soup. The bubbles started at the edges first. That was always how it went. The edges of the pot began to tremble and hiss before the center caught up, and the smell that rose with the first threads of steam was the smell of comfort so specific to childhood that decades later, a single breath of tomato soup heating on a stove anywhere, in any kitchen, is enough to carry you back completely. Not gradually, not partially, but all at once. The whole thing. The kitchen, the afternoon light, the sound of the can opener still going around in your memory. Good. You still know the jingle. Try not to hear it right now. You already can't. Campbell's had been singing that phrase since 1935. And by the 1960s, it had stopped being advertising and become something else entirely. A small piece of shared cultural memory. Something everyone knew the way they knew the words to a hymn. Not because they had studied it, but because it had simply been present long enough to become permanent. And the Campbell's kids, those round-cheeked, rosy-faced children who had been smiling from magazine advertisements and recipe cards since 1904, were still there in the 1960s, still beaming their cheerful, uncomplicated endorsement of the whole enterprise of warming soup and feeding families. They appeared on labels, on the little promotional materials, in the advertisements in Good Housekeeping and Ladies' Home Journal, on the mugs. Those mugs, thick, ceramic, solid, with a handle sized for a real grip. The kind of mug that was heavy in small hands, and still warm long after the soup was finished. You might have had a set of them. You might still have one, somewhere, with a chip on the rim that faces backward when you hold it, because it's still the right mug. It holds the right amount of soup. You've never replaced it. Home cooks, most of them women in the 1960s, managing households and children and budgets with the kind of quiet, practical genius that rarely received its proper recognition, had adopted Campbell's soup not as a shortcut, but as a foundation. A reliable, consistent, trusted beginning from which something wonderful could be made. They were not being lazy. They were being smart. They understood that cooking for a family, day after day, week after week, for the length of an entire decade, required efficiency and reliability, and the deep confidence that comes from knowing that when you reach for a tool, it will work. The can was a tool. The most reliable tool in the kitchen, arguably. Open it. And what came out was exactly what you expected. Every time. No variation, no surprises, no disappointment. Just that clean, concentrated, unmistakable goodness. The small spiral-bound cookbooklets that Campbell's distributed, free or nearly free, through grocery stores and the mail, sometimes tucked into the pages of women's magazines, were some of the most used recipe resources in mid-century American kitchens. They were modest little things, nothing grand about them, printed on thick, slightly glossy paper with photographs in that warm, saturated Kodachrome style that made everything look like it was being served at the best Sunday dinner you had ever attended. Full-color casseroles straight from the oven, their tops perfectly golden. Bowls of soup with steam that had been arranged very carefully to look exactly as inviting as possible. The Campbell's logo in the corner of every page, reliable as a signature. You probably haven't thought about those little booklets in 40 years. But if someone described the cover to you right now, described that particular shade of red, that specific layout, the cheerful, practical font, you would recognize it immediately. You might even be able to picture exactly which shelf of which kitchen it lived in. The recipes inside were not complicated. That was the point. They assumed a stocked pantry. They assumed you had a can of cream of mushroom, a can of chicken broth, perhaps a can of cream of celery that had been waiting for its moment. They assumed that the cook was capable and practical and interested in a genuinely good result without unnecessary ceremony. And they delivered. The casseroles came out golden. The sauces were smooth and rich. The families eating them asked for seconds, and sometimes thirds. And the recipe card got propped up against the salt shaker 100 times until the corners curled and the photograph faded and the handwritten note. In the margin, someone had adjusted the amount of mushrooms, added onion powder, used sour cream instead of milk, was almost illegible. No one measured in those kitchens. That is the first thing to understand about how these dishes actually got made. The women who produced them were not chefs in any formal sense. They were cooks, improvisers, adapters, people who had made these dishes so many times that the recipe card had become a suggestion rather than a law, a starting point from which their own judgment and experience and the particular contents of their refrigerator took over. A can of this, a can of that, something left from Sunday. It always worked. It always worked because the base was trustworthy, because the soup did its job every single time, and because years of practice had built an instinct in those hands that no written recipe could fully capture. Do you still make any of the old casserole recipes? The ones that started with a can of cream of mushroom and ended with everyone asking for seconds. Green Bean Casserole was 10 years old in 1965. It had been created in 1955 by Dorcas Riley, a food scientist in the Campbell's test kitchen in Camden, New Jersey, and it had spread through America's home kitchens with the quiet, unstoppable efficiency of something genuinely, practically good. Not through advertising campaigns, not through celebrity endorsement, but through the oldest and most reliable distribution system in the history of food. A neighbor brought it to a church supper and was asked, before the table was even cleared, for the recipe. Her sister made it for Thanksgiving. Her sister's coworker made it for Christmas. And on it went, across the country, hand to hand, recipe card to recipe card, until cream of mushroom soup and green beans and those fried onions on top were as much a part of the American holiday table as the turkey itself. 2 cans of cream of mushroom, green beans, a splash of milk, a little soy sauce, black pepper, and on top, those canned fried onion rings, scattered over everything in the last 10 minutes of baking, so they came out of the oven golden and faintly crisp against the creamy, steaming base. The dish took 20 minutes to assemble and 40 in the oven, and fed a crowd and produced something that smelled. When the casserole dish came out and the steam hit the kitchen air, exactly like Sunday dinner was supposed to smell. Then there was tuna noodle casserole. Cream of mushroom again. The quiet foundation of a dish that was not glamorous in any respect, but was deeply, earnestly satisfying. Egg noodles, canned tuna, frozen peas stirred in at the last moment, the soup thinned with milk. The whole thing topped with crushed crackers and baked until the top was golden and the edges bubbled gently against the sides of the dish. It was a Wednesday meal, a stretch-the-budget meal. A meal made because the pantry was ready, and the week had been long, and nobody wanted anything more complicated than warm and filling, and genuinely, quietly good. The families who ate it didn't call it humble. They just called it dinner, and they cleaned their plates. Scalloped potatoes with cream of mushroom. This one required patience. The potatoes had to be sliced thin, paper thin, if you had the patience and the knife for it, which the good cooks always did, and then layered in a baking dish with onion rings and salt and pepper. The soup poured over everything and thinned just slightly with milk. The whole construction covered with foil and sent into a slow, patient oven for an hour, and then uncovered for the last 20 minutes to brown on top. What came out was tender and silky and saturated with that mushroom richness, the edges slightly caramelized where the sauce had worked its way to the side of the dish and concentrated against the ceramic. It went with everything. The pot roast. The pork chops. It went with nothing more than a salad and a piece of buttered bread on a night when the main dish hadn't quite cooperated. The pot roast itself. The Sunday pot roast deserves its own moment, because in many households, it was the meal of the week, not just dinner on Sunday, but a kind of weekly ceremony, the meal around which the whole day organized itself. The chuck roast went into the Dutch oven, browned on both sides in a little oil, until the outside was dark and fragrant, and the kitchen filled with that deep, meaty richness that meant something serious was underway. Then, the vegetables. Carrots cut in thick coins, potatoes halved, onions quartered, and over everything, poured from a can, opened with that familiar metallic puncture and steady revolution of the crank, Campbell's beef broth. Sometimes cream of mushroom alongside it, for a deeper sauce. The lid went on. The oven was set low, patient, unhurried. And for the next 3 hours, the house did something extraordinary. It became the smell of Sunday. Do you remember it? By the time that lid came off, by the time the pot was lifted onto the stovetop and the ladle went in, the broth had reduced and darkened and absorbed everything the vegetables and the meat had given it. And what was in that pot was not merely food. It was the completion of something. It was Sunday arriving properly, fulfilling its obligation to be warm and generous and worthy of the week just past. The meatloaf glazed with tomato soup. The sweetness and slight acidity of the soup, concentrated by the heat of the oven into something shining and caramelized across the top of the loaf. The inside dense and savory and tender. Chicken a la king, made with cream of mushroom and cream of chicken together. The peas and pimento stirred in gently, the whole thing ladled over white rice in wide, shallow bowls, steam rising from each serving. Cream-chipped beef on toast, called by a name in more irreverent households that the ladies of the church cookbook committee would not have printed, made with cream of celery enriching the white sauce. The dried beef shredded into ribbons through it, poured over thick-cut buttered toast in a way that was humble and peculiar, and somehow absolutely right on a cold morning. Chicken and rice baked in cream of mushroom. The rice absorbing everything over an hour in a slow oven. The chicken pieces going in pale and coming out golden and falling gently toward the bone. the whole dish arriving at the table with no ceremony whatsoever, and being received as if it were a small feast. There were other soups that deserved their moment too, because the red and white lineup was not only about casseroles and bases and culinary foundations. Some of those cans were there for a different reason entirely. Bean with bacon soup, thick, almost hearty enough to be a meal by itself. The great navy bean, soft and rich in that smoky, hammy broth. A soup that a father might heat on a Saturday afternoon while the family was out, and eat standing at the stove with crackers, and not feel the slightest need to apologize for the simplicity of the arrangement. Split pea with ham, which was a soup of late autumn and deep winter, green and dense and deeply savory. The kind of soup that felt like it had been cooking all day, even when it had come from a can, opened with that familiar 2-minute sound. French onion, which seemed slightly more sophisticated than its companions, slightly more European somehow, the kind of soup that arrived at a dinner party, heated on the stove, poured into oven-safe bowls. A slice of toasted bread floating on top, a handful of Swiss cheese melted under the broiler until it blistered and browned at the edges, and made whoever served it feel quietly accomplished. Minestrone, full of vegetables and pasta, and a deep tomato-vegetable richness that made it the right soup for any day that needed something close to a full meal in a bowl. Cream of celery, mild and smooth, and slightly sweet, better than it sounded, and more useful than you might have expected. They were all there, every variety, lined up in their matching labels, each one different in character and flavor and purpose, but all of them carrying that same underlying reliability, that same quiet promise. You knew what you were getting when you reached for any one of them, and knowing what you were getting, when so much else in the world was uncertain, was not a small thing. Picture a Saturday morning in February, the snow still deep outside, and the week's errands done, and nothing pressing for the next several hours. A father at the stove, not a common sight on a weekday, but Saturday had its own rhythms. Opening a can of tomato soup, adding the milk without measuring it, stirring with a little more patience than was strictly necessary, adding an extra splash from the bottle because he liked it creamier than the can suggested. The metallic tang of the open can still in the air, the spoon going around in slow circles, the bubbles starting at the edges, that same sequence, that same patient progression from the outside in, the steam rising and curling in the cold kitchen light. He poured it into the thick mug, the one with the slightly chipped rim, and sat down at the kitchen table and held it in both hands and drank it in the quiet of a Saturday morning that asked nothing of him and was nothing up. In that particular moment, as close to perfectly content as a person can be. Each of these dishes was a collaboration. The cook and the can. The recipe card, consulted and then set aside. The instinct and the trust working together in a kitchen that smelled always of something almost ready. And through all of it, quietly, the can opener waited on the counter in its usual spot. The wooden spoon stood in the ceramic holder beside the stove. The cans lined up on the shelf. Infrastructure. The physical apparatus of a household that had decided, without announcement, to feed its people well, every day without ceremony, without particular credit, as simply and reliably as breathing. Now, the story behind the label. It is 1898. A Campbell's executive named Herberton Williams attends a football game between Cornell University and the University of Pennsylvania. Cornell has new uniforms that season, vivid red and white, bright and immediate on the field, the kind of color combination that catches the eye even from the upper rows of the bleachers, holds it, refuses to let go. Williams is struck by the combination. He is, At this particular moment in his life, thinking about labels, the Campbell Soup Company is reorganizing, growing, and the labels on the cans need to be redone. They had been orange and blue, serviceable but unmemorable. Not the kind of label that reached out from a grocery shelf and stopped a customer in the aisle. Red and white, the Cornell University football colors. A bright autumn afternoon, a pair of eyes in the crowd that happened to notice the right thing at the right moment. The label change was made, and from that year forward, for more than a century, the Campbell Soup can would wear those colors, that warm, saturated red, and that clean, honest white, with a consistency so complete and so unwavering that the combination itself eventually became a kind of cultural shorthand, a visual fact about America as embedded and familiar as anything in the national pantry. It was exactly what Andy Warhol saw in 1962 when he arranged 32 canvases at the Ferris Gallery in Los Angeles, each one depicting a single variety of Campbell's condensed soup, one for each variety in the lineup that year. Some people laughed. Some were irritated. Some thought it was a joke, an insult, or both. But Warhol understood, with the particular clarity that great artists sometimes possess, that the red and white can had already become more than a can. It had become a cultural fact. It was present in every kitchen in America, recognized by every person who had ever reached for it, as familiar as a face in the family. The repetition, can after can, label after label, all identical across the decades, was not the absence of meaning, but an abundance of it. It was proof that the ordinary could achieve a kind of perfection, quiet and consistent and completely reliable, that no amount of sophistication or novelty could surpass. Cornell football, a game that happened, a pair of eyes that noticed, and 100 years of the most recognized grocery can in American history. That is where the red and white came from. And now, whenever you encounter it, wherever that label finds you, in whatever grocery store aisle or kitchen pantry or distant memory, you will see, just for a moment, a football field in autumn. The players in their bright new uniforms. A man in the stands who doesn't know yet that he is about to change the American kitchen forever. And now, cream of mushroom, the soup that was in every casserole that wasn't using tomato. The one that was always the first to run out, always the first name added to the grocery list. The one the recipe cards called for in quantities of 2 and 3. The one that built the mid-century American casserole culture almost single-handedly and never once asked for any credit. Cream of mushroom was never glamorous. It didn't have the bright primary warmth of tomato. It didn't have the simple golden clarity of chicken noodle. It was darker, earthier, more complex in its depth. A soup that tasted of the forest floor in autumn, of something wild, very carefully civilized, of richness in its most concentrated form. And that density, that thick, deeply savory, almost unctuous quality, was exactly what made it invaluable as an ingredient rather than merely as a soup. It added body to a sauce in seconds. It enriched a braise without requiring the kind of hours-long reduction that turned an ordinary Tuesday into an impossible one. It transformed a simple baking dish of chicken and rice into something that came out of the oven fragrant and golden and satisfying in a way that seemed, improbably, to taste like effort and care and hours of attentive cooking, when in truth it had required a can, a casserole dish, and patience enough to let the oven do its work. The steam that rose from a pot of cream of mushroom heating on the stove was unlike any other smell in the domestic repertoire. It was earthy and rich and faintly sweet in the way that mushrooms, cooked slowly, can achieve a sweetness Not a dessert sweetness, but the sweetness of something deeply savory that has given everything it has into the surrounding liquid. If you were in the next room when that smell reached you, you paused. You paused. You registered it. And something in you, some old domestic instinct laid down in childhood and never erased, said dinner, said home, warm, said someone is in the kitchen taking care of things. Now, the sick day. Let's talk about the sick day. Because if there is one memory that almost every person who grew up in the 1960s shares in some version, it is the sick day memory. The morning you woke with a sore throat or a low fever, or the heavy specific feeling that said you would not be going to school today. The complicated relief of it. Slightly guilty. Slightly delicious. The phone call your mother made to the school. And then, sometime around midday, from the kitchen, the sound of the can opener. Chicken noodle. Almost always chicken noodle. Not because it was the most sophisticated soup in the lineup. Not because it had the most complex flavor profile. But because chicken noodle soup had been, for generations, the American remedy for everything that ailed a person, not medicine in the clinical sense, but better than medicine. Medicine tasted bitter and came in a bottle with a child's safety cap and had to be measured by a teaspoon. Chicken noodle soup came in a mug. That ceramic mug, heavy and solid, the handle sized for a real grip, the warmth bleeding through the ceramic into cold hands the moment the mug was lifted. The soup inside was not too hot to drink. Or if it was, you waited, holding the mug with both hands in your lap, feeling the warmth moving from the ceramic into your palms and up through your fingers and into your wrists, and from there seeming to reach some central place in your body where the cold and the ache had settled. The noodles were thin and soft and had absorbed just enough broth to be tender, without falling apart. The broth was clear and golden and salty in a way that was immediately, specifically, recognizably correct. The small pieces of carrot, if there were any in the can that day, the flecks of parsley, the steam that rose and touched your face when you bent close to the mug, warm and slightly damp, carrying that chicken and salt smell that existed nowhere else in the world, except in this context, in this moment. On this particular afternoon, beside the mug, on the TV tray, your mother had unfolded and carried in without being asked, were the saltines. Always saltines. Arranged on a small plate, or simply stacked beside the mug without ceremony. Buttered if your stomach was steady, plain if it wasn't. You crushed them into the broth, and watched them absorb the soup, and soften at the edges, and turn slightly translucent before you ate them. Or you dipped them, holding one corner of the cracker in the soup for exactly the right amount of time. Not so long that the cracker collapsed, not so brief that it stayed dry. The combination of warm, salty broth and slightly crumbled, faintly soggy cracker was perfect in the way that only the simplest things can be perfect. Perfect with a completeness that no amount of culinary sophistication could improve upon or replicate. The television was on low, not because you were watching it exactly, but because it was a companion, a presence, a sound in the room that meant you were not entirely alone in your discomfort. The quilt from the hall closet was on the sofa, spread over your legs. The mug was in both hands, and the steam was on your face. And the first sip, careful, because it was still very hot at the edge, moved down your throat and into your chest, and something eased. Not the illness exactly, something else, something larger and harder to name. The certainty, delivered through a can of soup by someone who had opened it specifically for you, that you were watched over, that you were cared for, that the world had contracted to this sofa and this mug and this particular afternoon. And within those boundaries, everything was being handled. The steam from the mug, the warmth against your hands, the specific saltiness of the first taste. These things were a language. They said, "I see you. I am here. Drink this." The soup and sandwich combination deserves its moment too, because it was one of the great simple meals of the American 20th century. And in the 1960s, it was nearly universal. Lunch, mostly. Saturday lunch, or the lunch of the snow day, which was its own category entirely. A category defined first by the radio announcement in the early morning, the moment of absolute jubilation, the rush to the window to confirm that yes, the world outside was white and still and impassable, that school was genuinely not happening today. The sled came out. The snow fort was constructed in stages across the morning. And when you finally came inside, red-nosed and damp to the elbows, stamping snow off your boots in the back hall, the kitchen was already warm, and the sound of the can opener had already begun. Campbell's tomato soup made with milk. Not water, milk, for the creamier, fuller version. The one that turned the soup from a sharp orange red into that soft, beautiful rose pink that was somehow exactly the right color for a cold afternoon. Comforting in its warmth and softness. And beside the soup pot, in the cast iron skillet already heated and already holding a square of butter that had browned and sizzled and spread across the black surface, the grilled cheese was happening. The bread pressing down in the butter, the sizzle, the smell of butter browning and bread crisping, and then about 2 minutes in, the first suggestion of melting cheese beginning to seep toward the edges of the sandwich. The flip, at exactly the right moment, not a moment too soon, so both sides achieve that particular deep golden brown that a cast iron skillet produces when it has been properly seasoned and properly heated. Cut diagonally, always diagonally, because there was something about the diagonal cut that made a grilled cheese sandwich into something slightly different from an ordinary sandwich, something that acknowledged the occasion and rose to meet it. The corner of the triangle went into the soup first. That was the ritual. The dip, the corner of the crisp buttered bread going into the hot pink soup, and held there for a moment, absorbing slightly, before being lifted and eaten. The combination of the crisp bread and the yielding cheese and the warm, slightly creamy soup was not a combination anyone had ever written a treatise about or given a name. It was just what you did on a snow day when you were 10 years old in 1964 or 1967, or whenever yours was. And it was, in its absolute simplicity, perfect. The bowl afterward, the warmth of it in both hands, the last of the soup swirled from the sides with the spoon, the final sip taken from the rim because a spoon was barely necessary by then, the empty bowl set down, the warmth residing now, not in the ceramic, but inside you. Settled and quiet and steady. That warmth was not nothing. It was not a small thing dressed up in nostalgic language to seem more than it was. It was genuinely something. A form of care made physical, made edible, made as immediate and real as the cold outside the window and the warmth inside the kitchen. Because that is what Campbell's soup was, at its deepest level. Not a product, not a brand, not a corporation making food for profit, though it was certainly all of those things too. It was love, ladled. That is not an overstatement. The bowl of soup placed on the TV tray beside a sick child. That was love in a ceramic mug. The casserole assembled on Sunday morning to be ready when the family came home from church. That was love in a baking dish, covered with foil, trusting the oven. The tomato soup made with milk on a snow day. the grilled cheese going golden in the pan beside it, the whole meal timed, so it was hot on the table. The moment the cold child came through the back door, that was love, expressed in the only language that mattered at that particular moment in that particular kitchen. And here is something that rarely gets said about mid-century American home cooking. The people who did it, day after day, in those kitchens were remarkable. The mother who could plan a week's meals on a Sunday evening around what the pantry held, who knew, without consulting anything, that cream of mushroom plus leftover chicken plus whatever was in the vegetable drawer would produce something that her family would eat without complaint and ask about again, who could open the back door at 3 in the afternoon and have soup on the table by the time her child's coat was hung up and the school bag was where it belonged, who made tuna noodle casserole on Wednesday and green bean casserole for church potluck and scalloped potatoes for Sunday and pot roast for Sunday and meatloaf on Thursday, and never once repeated herself in a way that felt like a failure of imagination, because each dish was different enough, and each dish was good enough, and the family was fed every single day. The Campbell's can was part of that competence, part of the infrastructure that made it possible. It was reliable in a way that freed the cook to be creative, to improvise, to reach into the refrigerator and combine what she found there with what was on the shelf and produce something that tasted, improbably, better than the sum of its parts. The cooking itself was an act of care so continuous, so daily, so thoroughly woven into the structure of ordinary life that it rarely got called what it was. It didn't have a name. It didn't receive a ceremony. It was just what happened in the kitchen, quietly, reliably, day after day. The can opener working, the pot on the stove, the wooden spoon going around in patient circles, the steam rising, and its presence was so constant that its absence, when it occasionally occurred, was immediately and deeply felt. There is a particular moment in the life of a hot bowl of soup that is worth describing very precisely. The moment when you pick it up, both hands around the mug or the bowl, the heat moving through the ceramic into your palms, and you bring it close enough to smell it before you taste it. The steam reaches your face first. That warm, damp, concentrated breath of whatever the soup is. Chicken and salt and a thin, golden clarity. Tomato and its bright, slightly sweet acidity. Mushroom and its deep, earthy, almost mysterious richness. For just a moment, before the first sip, before the taste completes the experience, there is just the smell and the warmth and the held promise of what is about to happen. And then the first taste, the temperature exactly right, the salt exactly right, the familiar roundness of whatever soup it is hitting the back of your tongue and spreading forward, and the warmth moves down, and something in you settles, and the kitchen is warm, and the afternoon is whatever it needs to be, and everything for this moment is exactly as it should be. That is what was in the can. Not just condensed soup, not just a convenient food product. Wires Dian. Way, not just a convenient food product. That moment, that specific, irreplaceable, utterly reliable warmth. The decade ended, as all decades do. The 1960s passed into the 1970s, and the kitchens changed, slowly, and the cooking changed with them, and the pantry shelf evolved along with everything else. But the cans were still there, cream of mushroom and chicken, noodle and tomato, still lined up in their red and white certainty, still waiting to be opened with the old familiar sound. The label still wearing the colors of a Cornell football uniform that a man named Herberton Williams noticed on an autumn afternoon in 1898. The gold medallion still there, still earned, still as trustworthy as anything in the house. And what those cans held, in the end, was not merely food, but a whole domestic history. The record of 10,000 ordinary meals. The memory of the can opener. That specific, particular clank and slow revolution. Going around in the same kitchen, in the same spot on the counter, 10,000 Tuesday afternoons and Wednesday evenings and Sunday morning. The memory of condensed soup, gliding from the can into the pot, retaining the shape of the container for a moment before collapsing into itself and becoming something that needed heat and liquid to complete it. The memory of the wooden spoon going around in circles, patient and steady. The cook not watching the clock, but watching the edges of the pot for the first slow bubbles. The memory of steam rising and touching a face, bent close over the stove, warm and damp and carrying everything the soup promised before the first taste was even taken. The memory of the ceramic bowl or the ceramic mug, both hands wrapped around it. The warmth from the ceramic, a physical thing, something that moved through the palms and into the fingers and settled somewhere deep and central and needed. All of that in a can that cost less than $1 and lived on a pantry shelf and wore a label that a football game had inspired 100 years before. All of that available to anyone who reached for it. When did we stop keeping that red and white can in the pantry, as if it were as essential as flour and sugar? And do we still reach for it when we need to feel that someone is taking care of us? The can is still there. Somewhere on a grocery shelf, the red and white label faces out into the fluorescent light, as recognizable and familiar as a face from childhood. The soup inside is the same. Gold medallion is still there. The can opener still makes that sound. The small, bright clank of the tooth, finding the edge, the slow, steady revolution of the crank, the lid lifting. Somewhere right now in a kitchen, someone is making chicken noodle soup for a child who is not well and needs to feel better. Somewhere, someone is reaching for 2 cans of cream of mushroom because there is a casserole to be made and a family coming home. Somewhere on a cold afternoon, a pot of tomato soup is heating on a stove, while a grilled cheese sandwich goes golden in the pan beside it, and the steam is beginning to rise, and the kitchen is beginning to smell like every snow day there ever was. And somewhere, very possibly in a kitchen, possibly in a kitchen that is yours, a person is holding a ceramic bowl of soup in both hands. The bowl is warm. The steam is on their face. The first taste is salty and familiar and exactly right, the same as it was in 1962 and 1965 and 1968 and every year before and since. Unchanging and reliable and quietly. Completely perfect. The sound of the can opener, the glop of condensed soup in the pot, the slow circles of the wooden spoon, the steam rising, bowl warm in both hands. It was never just soup. It was everything that came with it. The hands that opened the can, the kitchen that held the warmth, the bowl that held the soup, and the certainty, delivered through something as small and humble and red and white as a condensed soup can, that you were not alone, that you were known, that someone was in the kitchen and something warm was almost ready. It never was just soup. It never was.